Shalom, I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it is as follows. Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas said that he promised Israel Justice Minister Tzipi Livni during their controversial meeting in London on May the 15th that the government would work within its own, not Hamas's, guidelines. He stressed that he himself may not head the Palestinian Unity Government, but that another Fatah official may, meaning Palestinian Prime Minister Rami Hamdallah. He also indicated that the Palestinian Unity Government will be comprised entirely of independent Palestinian Arab politicians, and that it would be based upon four international principles: recognizing Israel, recognizing the terms of international agreements, and the explicit rejection of violence and terrorism. He said the idea of the reconciliation process was to go toward Palestinian elections, but that if something goes wrong along the way, we'll re-examine the matters. In addition, Abbas said that the Palestinian leadership does not intend to seek membership in or help from additional United Nations and other international organizations in the near future. Abbas said that 2 days before he applied for membership in 15 international organizations at the start of April, one of the steps that led to the collapse of the peace talks, he sent a formal letter to Netanyahu's peace emissary Yitzhak Molko and to the American Special Envoy Martin Indyk, in which he warned that if Israel did not free a fourth and final batch of long-term Palestinian prisoners as promised, he would apply to join the 15 groups. He said he delayed the implementation of what had been a decision by the Palestinian leadership to join the organizations for 2 days to see if the Israeli government would change its position, but that did not happen. Israel had balked at releasing the fourth group of prisoners because Abbas sought the freeing of Israeli Arabs as part of the group and because he had not committed to extending the peace talks beyond the April 29th deadline. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was on the verge of firing Israel Chief Negotiator and Justice Minister Tzipi Livni after her recent meeting with Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas in London on May the 15th, but restrained himself. In her meeting with Abbas, Livni expressed Israel's dissatisfaction with the Palestinian Unity Agreement that Mahmoud Abbas made with its rival Hamas of the Gaza Strip. The meeting was the first between Abbas and a senior Israeli official since Israel pulled out of the peace talks in response to the Hamas-Fatah Unity Pact. According to reports, Livni had informed Netanyahu that she was to meet with Abbas. When Netanyahu heard about the meeting, he criticized the move. Previously, Netanyahu had not been aware of the meeting. When Netanyahu found out what Livni was planning, he specifically told her to not meet with Abbas, a directive she subsequently ignored. Netanyahu was prepared to fire Livni, but changed his mind at the last moment after sources close to Israel Finance Minister Yair Lapid indicated that Livni's firing would trigger a coalition crisis within Netanyahu's government. Livni defended her actions by saying, "In order to understand what Mahmoud Abbas wants in the peace process, we need to talk to him. I believe in direct negotiations. There are no formal negotiations now, but I was in London and Abbas was in London, and therefore the meeting took place," she said. She added, "Suspending the negotiations does not mean boycotting the other side. Boycotting is silly when we are here and the conflict with the Palestinians remains." Israel Intelligence Minister Yuval Steinitz, a member of Netanyahu's Likud party who was close to the Prime Minister, said that if Israel's chief peace negotiator, Justice Minister Tzipi Livni, meets again with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas against the wishes of Netanyahu, that she will be fired. Netanyahu has thus far treated Livni with a certain amount of mercy, said Steinitz, but if Livni defied Netanyahu again, she will no longer be Justice Minister. All ministers must respect government policy, said Steinitz. The decision-making inter-cabinet voted last month to suspend all negotiations with the Palestinians after Mahmoud Abbas approved a unity pact between his Fatah faction of the PLO and the Islamist extremist group Hamas of the Gaza Strip, which calls for the destruction of Israel. Livni voted in favor of this decision. Livni rejected calls by colleagues in the opposition to quit Netanyahu's coalition government, saying that she could be more effective from within the government, particularly, according to her, in preventing Israel Economic Minister Naftali Bennett of the Jewish Home Party and others from taking the country in an irresponsible direction. Bennett would be delighted for her to lead the coalition, she said, and thus to clear the field for his agenda, including unilateral annexation of parts of the West Bank. She was using all the political power that I have to thwart the extreme right, she said, noting sadly that her faction was smaller than what it was in previous Knessets. It's important to be the gatekeeper against dangerous ideas, she said. Meanwhile, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the Palestinian leadership is unwilling to make compromises for peace, calling into question the wisdom of diplomatic negotiations. Netanyahu laid blame for the collapse of peace talks on Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas and hinted that Israel may have to consider taking unilateral steps to leave the West Bank. Negotiations are always preferable, but 6 Israeli prime ministers since the 1993 Oslo Accords have failed in their pursuit of a negotiated settlement, he said. They've always thought we were on the verge of success. And then Yasser Arafat backed off in 2000, and Mahmoud Abbas backed off from an agreement with Israel Prime Minister Ehud Olmert in 2008 because the Palestinians can't conclude these negotiations. We don't have a Palestinian leadership that is willing to do that. The minimal set of conditions that any Israeli government would need for a peace agreement, the Palestinians are not willing to agree to. Asked about the possibility of a unilateral withdrawal from the West Bank, Netanyahu acknowledged that the idea was gaining traction across the Israeli political spectrum, but warned that Israel could not risk another Gaza, which was taken over by Hamas after Israel unilaterally withdrew in August of 2005. Many Israelis are asking themselves if there are certain unilateral steps that could theoretically make sense, but people also recognize that the unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza didn't improve the situation or advance peace with the Palestinians, he said. While Netanyahu backed efforts by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry to bring both sides to the table, he blamed Abbas for not taking the United States seriously. What has Abbas done? Nothing. He refused to entertain Kerry's efforts to try and lock horns on the core issues. He internationalized the conflict, he said, referring to the Palestinian leader's decision to apply to 15 international treaties, which Israel said broke a Palestinian commitment not to apply for statehood at the UN. Israel remains committed to face-to-face talks with the Palestinians as the best path forward to 2 states for 2 peoples, Netanyahu said, but it refuses to negotiate with Fatah, that is the sect of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, as long as Fatah honors its unity deal with Hamas of the Gaza Strip. The broad-based options that members of the Israeli government have put forward fall into 3 basic categories: an economic plan, withdrawal from isolated settlements, or annexation of territory in the West Bank. There are some points of consensus in Israel around the peace process with the Palestinians in the nation's future, Netanyahu said. The first point of consensus is that Israel doesn't want a binational state. Another point of consensus is that Israel doesn't want an Iranian proxy in the territories that we vacate. We want a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the nation state of the Jewish people. How do you get that if you can't get it through negotiations? The Palestinians don't agree to recognizing Israel as the Jewish nation state, and it's not clear to me that they'll agree to elements of demilitarization that are required in any conceivable plan that works, Netanyahu said. The problem with the negotiated solution, he said, is that at present there is no grounds for consensus with the Palestinians. No matter what the spin is about blaming Israel, do we actually expect Abbas, who seems to be embracing Hamas, to give a negotiated deal? In all likelihood, no. I hope he does, but I'm not sure he's going to do it, Netanyahu said. There is an emerging consensus that we don't have a partner who can challenge constituencies, do something unpopular, do something that is difficult. Abbas has not done anything to challenge the prevailing Palestinian consensus. In fact, he's doing the opposite. The Hamas reconciliation, internationalizing the conflict, not giving one iota on the right of return, not giving an iota on the Jewish state, he wouldn't deal with Kerry's framework, Netanyahu said. Israel Transportation Minister Yisrael Katz said that he would present a bill to redraw the lines of the Jerusalem municipality to include a number of West Bank settlements in a single Greater Jerusalem policy. The settlements to be amalgamated into Jerusalem under the bill include the city of Ma'ale Adumim, Givat Ze'ev, the Gush Etzion block, and Beitar Illit, containing a total Jewish population of over 150,000. This week, Israel will celebrate Jerusalem Day to mark 47 years of the unification of the city, Katz said. This is the time to advance an initiative that will strengthen Jerusalem, expand its borders, and preserve its Jewish national character. Katz's proposed legislation could constitute an alternative, or a step backward, annexation of the areas into Israeli territory, a move that has been repeatedly advocated by Economic Minister Naftali Bennett. Earlier that day, Communication Minister Gilad Erdan called on the Israeli government to start preparing for the annexation of Area C of the West Bank. Wherever there is a Jewish population in the West Bank that should remain in place, we can start to prepare to annex that area if there is no Palestinian partner, and the situation seems unlikely to change, Erdogan said. In any peace agreement with the Palestinians, Israel must keep the Jordan Valley, said Israel Intelligence Minister Yuval Steinitz. Anyone who comes to Israel can understand that Israel cannot give up the Jordan Valley, he said. If we pull out from the Jordan Valley, we will really risk Israel's security and its very existence, he said. The Jordan Valley is the only possible reasonable defense line in the east between Iran and its proxies, said Steinitz. This includes Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, he said. If someone thinks Israel can afford moving the line from here 50 kilometers to the west, this will be a disaster, he said. Only the Israeli army can perform the vital mission of securing the Jordan Valley, Steinitz said. This task cannot be left to an international security force, he said, and added that it could not be done by Palestinians or Europeans. The Palestinians have insisted that Israel withdraw from the valley so that it can be folded into the future borders of their state. Israel's insistence that the valley must remain in its hands for security reasons was one of the deep disagreements that marked the 9-month negotiating period, which ended on April the 29th. Israel Economic Minister Naftali Bennett said that he supports the possibility that Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is considering taking unilateral steps to establish a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the Jewish state, Bennett said. I hear talk of Israel's unilateral actions. I support that. We are pushing for applying Israeli law unilaterally over Gush Etzion, Ariel, the Jordan Valley, Ma'ale Adumim, Ofra, Alf Menashe, the Ben Gurion Airport envelope, Samaria, Judea, and the rest of the Jewish settlement enterprise, Bennett stated. I will continue to push for it with all my might until it happens, and it will happen. The Arabs have decided that they will no longer come to the table, he continued. The era of negotiations has ended. They are acting unilaterally by going to the United Nations and applying for membership in 15 UN organizations and institutions. Now it is Israel's turn. Bennett said that he would give Palestinians complete freedom of movement, which requires removing all roadblocks and checkpoints in the West Bank. In particular, Israel should dismantle the security barrier erected throughout the last decade to defend against Palestinian terror attacks during the Second Intifada. Bennett further proposed Arab autonomy in the areas A and B in the West Bank and the offering of full Israeli citizenship to Arab residents of Area C of the West Bank. Israel Chief Negotiator Tzipi Livni blasted Jewish Home Chairman Naftali Bennett's plans for Israel to annex Area C of the West Bank, where there is a Jewish majority. Annexing Area C, she claimed, will lead to the end of Zionism. Well, that's going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.